So my name is Asher. I am a QRI collaborator in various different ways, of which we will see in this presentation. My background is in analytic philosophy, primarily in suffering reduction and sentience research. I've been doing a PhD for 6 years and still ongoing, but should be finished pretty soon, hopefully. And yeah, this talk is basically an overview / introduction to the particular research approach that QRI takes for, researching phenomenology, and then looking at how that informs consciousness research. And also I wanted to say I have a surprise at the end of this talk, so definitely stick around, really cool surprise announcement. Also, if hopefully this doesn't lose too many favor points, but would it be possible for someone to shut that door just in case there's a siren that goes off? Because I'm recording the presentation. Amazing. And one more thing I'd like to say is, maybe just before we start, if we can all kind of take a moment to just feel into our sensations, how we're feeling at the moment. I can give a brief qualitative report on myself. I'm feeling somewhat stimulated. I've had a few cups of coffee and I just had a Coke Zero, which has some caffeine. I'm feeling a bit overheated, feeling a bit nervous because there's so many eyes in front of me. And this is a talk that I'm really excited to share. It touches on some really exciting ideas. Otherwise feeling pretty happy and excited to actually get through it and then discuss it all with you. So this will come up later, but basically just a phenomenology kind of reading of how are you feeling, and see if you can just lean into certain sensations and explore them, and also throughout the talk. So I should also note, this is the third time I've done this talk. This is the most updated version. The first time was actually with Andres a few weeks ago at the Borderland, which is a Swedish burn. This is my second Borderland. I think it was his first Borderland. We had a pretty amazing turnout, and that was just a very kind of loose, how to write rigorous reports of exotic states of consciousness kind of workshop. We had a lot of people turn up. And I didn't have any slides. I did have my iPad there with my notes. But then I was in Berlin immediately after the burn, and rather than decompressing fully, I decided, okay, I'll do this talk again, but I'll do it more properly. So I gave it at the, this is, also from a few weeks ago, at the QRI Berlin meetup, and this is the third time I'll be doing it. So anyway, just some brief housekeeping before we begin. So by consciousness, I'm referring to phenomenal consciousness. Can I have a show of hands of how many people have heard of that term before? So roughly maybe half. So phenomenal consciousness refers to the raw qualities or properties that make our subjective experiences feel the way that they do. Other descriptions emphasize the what it is likeness of being in a particular moment of experience or of having a first-person perspective. And it's important to note, and this is one of the reasons that QRI exists as an institution, is that we don't know what consciousness is. It's completely absent from our models of reality at this current point in time. And to the extent that consciousness actually exists, and it's not just a leaky abstraction from our models of reality, this is a serious epistemic problem. I think consciousness exists. It's one of the foundational axioms for my entire doctoral dissertation, so I'm gonna assume this is a real thing, and we have to understand it better. Also, valence. Valence refers to, you might have heard this talked about in the context of affective state or hedonic tone, but valence refers to the intrinsically positive or negative quality of conscious experiences. And common examples would include, say, pleasure and pain, euphoria and dysphoria, happiness and unhappiness, and many other such emotions. As you can see in this diagram, taken from Principia Qualia, valence is not a binary property, so some experiences, obviously feel better or worse than other experiences. There's also significant variation between different valence states of consciousness. And it's important to note that because consciousness is missing from our models of reality, we also don't know what valence is, and valence is a property of phenomenal consciousness. And to this extent, or to the extent that valence has a normative value, which is essentially to say that it's important to consider in our actions. We typically think, unnecessary suffering is a bad thing to cause to another being. unless we have, overriding reasons, which, yeah. To the extent that it has normative value, this is a serious ethical problem, that we don't even know what this thing is. We have a lot of sophisticated ethical theories, and this is my background actually in animal welfare research. We have a lot of models of things that are, highly correlated with, I guess, what we expect would be suffering or various valent states of consciousness in certain contexts for different organisms or for different people, but we don't actually know what it is. So yeah, understanding what both consciousness and valence are, and also how we can directly interface with them, is one of the core missions of the Qualia Research Institute. So can I also get a show of hands, who here has heard of phenomenology? Oh wow, actually, okay, so yeah, more people than phenomenal consciousness, seemingly. So phenomenology is a philosophical tradition that began in the early 20th century, primarily with the works of German philosopher and mathematician Edmund Husserl, along with various other European philosophers such as Max Scheler, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Phenomenology as a discipline of philosophy aims to investigate the structure of different varieties of conscious experience, such as thought, emotion, desire, imagination, expressed through various different sensory modalities. And modern approaches to phenomenology, such as neurophenomenology, you can see this is an excellent paper I would recommend on the subject, strongly emphasize or look for correspondences between first-person and third-person data using modern scientific methods and theoretical tools such as differential geometry, topology, vector field analysis, dynamical systems theory, nonlinear flow, various things that didn't maybe exist when Husserl initially embarked on the project of establishing phenomenology as a research practice. But in the time since Husserl's writings, phenomenology, it hasn't actually really advanced that much. There are certainly papers like this, and then there are lots of other stages that are substantial or significant in its development as a field, but still a lot of people haven't heard of it. I suppose there's a selection effect in this audience with so many people having heard of phenomenology before. So, but usually when I use the term, people are like, oh, hold up, what is this big bundle of letters that you're throwing at me? So yeah, QRI's approach to phenomenology strongly emphasizes investigating non-ordinary or exotic states of consciousness. And by exotic or non-ordinary, I mean states of consciousness which fall outside of the set of ordinary human experiences. Those which were recruited by natural selection because they have or had a useful signaling function given our evolutionary history, given some basic assumptions about the conditions under which we evolved and consciousness evolved. So we think that looking at altered states is somewhat neglected, not only in phenomenology but just more broadly in consciousness studies. And to give a brief example, just imagine if chemistry had restricted itself to analysing matter at room temperature. We think it would have made little theoretical progress. So you can conceive of imagine two chemists in the 17th century, and they're both studying H2O, and they want to build a model of water, and one of them only studies it at room temperature and has a really sophisticated model, and it perfectly explains the behavior of the phenomenon that they're looking at. But then the other chemist is like, oh, hold on, I'm going to heat the water up, or I'm going to cool it down, I'm going to play with the temperature parameter, and then you see when you heat it up, it turns into a gas, and you can observe a phase transition, and then you cool it down and it turns into a solid. We would think that the second chemist would have a better model of the phenomenon, and that's because they're actively looking for non-ordinary states, of matter, and then they're updating their model based on that. QRI's approach is basically we should be looking actively for edge cases of human experience outside of room temperature consciousness to better inform our models of consciousness. So for example, we could look at advanced meditative states, such as I don't know if anyone's heard of the jhanas before, or cessation experiences. We could also look at, more generally, extreme emotional or physical experiences that humans experience in everyday life. But perhaps one of the most significant tools we currently have for studying consciousness through this method are psychedelics. So at the moment, there's a lot of data on exotic states of consciousness, such as those induced by psychedelics, on platforms like Erowid, Blue Light, Psychonaut Wiki. There are lots of trip reports that you can read about. These platforms are free and have been available for a very long time. Some of them are very fascinating. But unfortunately, the quality of the phenomenology that you find on these platforms is often very poor, and it's difficult to extract the right signal in order to, say, update your model correctly about, the exact character or the texture of certain states of consciousness that might result from like taking, like 4-HOMET, for example, or whatever other kind of psychoactive compounds are being researched or just like written about on those forums. Has anybody heard of this classic QRI post? Yeah, one, maybe a few. Awesome. Yeah, this is one of my favorites. So I would highly recommend checking that out. You can see it's on qri.org/blog/rigorous-reports. There are many different ways we can improve the quality of phenomenological research, especially when applied to studying psychedelics and other such compounds. But the main problem that we have is that we tend to focus on describing the semantic or intentional content of our experiences rather than their phenomenal content. So you can consider that experiences have structural content. So I would define this as the rudimentary properties, such as shapes, patterns, textures, that make up individual moments of experience, looking at like the most basic indivisible properties of conscious experiences and trying to kind of describe them both within individual moments of experience and how they evolve over time. And then there's the representational content, and these are basically like semantic concepts that one might use to characterize these properties at higher levels of abstraction. And so here's a quick example that I made. It's a bit silly, but yeah, hopefully you get the idea. So yeah, imagine this isn't, it's a thought bubble, but just imagine this represents my conscious experience in a given moment. And I'm seeing something that like, a representational analysis would say, oh, it's a smiling cat, of course. But if I'm a really good phenomenologist, then I'm going to want to try and give maybe like a mathematical analysis of the different shapes and maybe the different angles. So I could say right and left isosceles triangles, each containing a smaller triangle, middle center horizontal ellipse, and then there are 3 lines, and then I can list the degrees that they seem to appear to me in that moment. So this would be like one example of trying to take a more structured approach to, I guess, analysing the phenomenal character of moments of experience. And yeah, it's also important to note that, like, why do we take this approach, or why do we think this is relevant to like doing high quality research? Well, it's because you could have an arbitrary number of experiences that encode the representational content of a smiling cat. But when you're giving a description of an experience at a structural level, or if you're trying to give like a mathematical analysis of like the exact shapes and the relationship between the different components, this like heavily constrains the set of possible experiences you could be having. So I mean, we're still not like perfectly, with our words, we're still not perfectly capturing what we want to capture, which is like the what it is likeness of being in a particular moment of experience. But we are like heavily constraining it. Yeah, so at QRI, we believe the best way to understand subjective experiences involves analysing their structural rather than their representational content. And then I'll just give a few more examples as well. So an example of a trip report you might read would be that focuses on the structural content would be the ceiling was tessellated with a highly detailed texture organised along the 632 wallpaper symmetry group. More so, this tessellation was dynamic in that all of the shapes were shifting and morphing. And its symmetry group is like refers to basically it's a mathematical concept to describe like there are a finite number of ways in which like a repeating pattern across the surface you can transform its shape and maintain its structure. And so yeah, there are a finite number of symmetry groups, and this is like quite a precise account of exactly what is the, say in this case, the visual experience of staring at the wall. Another example. The left part of my visual field had a vertical wall I was attending to with peripheral vision. The wall felt like it was about 1 meter to my left and at a right angle. This hallucinated wall was vibrating at around 8 hertz and had 2 alternating layers that looked about 1 centimeter apart, one blue and one yellow. The colours were alternating at about half the speed at which the wall was vibrating. So yeah, this is another good example, especially because it tries to capture, like the frequency of the vibrations over time. So this would refer to, not just taking a single frame and analysing it, but looking at, how qualia change over time. And then just like one more, this is an example I really like, is referring to a positively valent 5-MeO-DMT experience, which I'll talk about later. I could not point out where in my experience the positive feeling was located, suggesting global rather than local coherence. Additionally, while the information content of the experience was extremely low, the feeling of connectedness was extremely high. I remember observing this as I was coming up and coming down from the peak. The perception of synchrony between different sensory modalities directly mapped onto the perceived intensity of my experience. So this is the kind of research we want to, or not encourage, but this is the kind of research we would like to, in a very safe and responsible manner, actually, grow, because we think this has like a non-trivial likelihood of actually advancing our understanding of what kind of thing consciousness is, looking at it from the inside. So, other relevant information for writing high-quality phenomenology reports might include, say, basic demographic information such as age, sex, and ethnicity. You might include health information such as how you were feeling in the time leading up to the experience, how well you slept the night before, in addition to, say, like general familiarity with exotic states of consciousness. A good example would be like, I'm not sure how many people have experienced cannabis for the first time, or the 100th time, or the 1000th time, but like it really changes, the more experience you have with a certain state of consciousness. You could consider it almost like a different drug. So that kind of information is useful if you're, hypothetically, if you're writing a trip report and you want to be as exact as possible. It's also important to include information about what substances are consumed and in what doses. You could say the method of intake, as this like drastically changes, how fast something might absorb and how quickly changes to your experience might be noted. You can also note, say, at what time you started noticing subjective effects and variability in its intensity at different stages of the trip, in order to more precisely kind of plot different phases, such as, the come up, the peak, and the come down. This is a cool diagram from this is a paper, Neural Correlates of the DMT Experience Assessed with Multivariance EEG. In this one, it was published in 2019, and participants were asked to provide minute-to-minute ratings of the subjective intensity of NN-DMT. So as you can see, there's significant differences between the group that were administered the DMT and then the placebo group, which is what you'd expect, hopefully. Again, consciousness is real, we're actually doing something when we take these substances. You could also consider your methods, or like the quality of your methods for attempting to capture information about these states. So most people who I've talked to who write trip reports tend to wait until the next day when they're feeling, a bit more back to normal before attempting to capture information about their state of consciousness. But it's actually important to note that the longer you wait, the more information gets compressed. It's similar to, I don't know if any of you have the experience of, having like a really vivid, amazing dream, and you're kind of like you wake up from it, but you still have your eyes closed, and you can just really picture certain like aspects of the dream. I often have the experience of like I will create characters in my dream, and I can still imagine their faces, but only when my eyes are closed. As soon as I open my eyes, the world floods in, and then it's just like it's gone, and I just lose that access. And so trying to kind of like minimize the distance between recording the information and maybe an analysis of the experience and the experience itself, that can help. I personally like to use for dream journaling, like I have an audio recorder on my phone, so then I don't even have to open my eyes and write things down. Also I think the more you do these kinds of things, like also like a dream journal, the more experience you get, the more skills you get, and the easier it becomes. So finally, something this might seem a bit like left field, or maybe I'm like biased because my background is in analytic philosophy. It's really important, I think, to state one's philosophical background assumptions before writing an analysis or interpreting their experience in the context of, say, a report. So this is a basic example of the relevance of background philosophical assumptions would be direct versus indirect realism about perception. These are some really cool diagrams that I really like this slide. But yeah, so a direct realist might speak about directly accessing intrinsic properties of the external world within their experience, and an indirect realist assumes that the relationship between their experience and the external world is contingent. In other words, that relationship is not necessary. So it's, the mapping could be different. On the slide here, you can see diagrams of two such theories of visual perception. So one illustrates Euclid's refinement of the Pythagorean extramission theory, which posits that visual experiences are the direct product of observers literally scanning their environments with visual rays. This is like quite a popular theory for some hundreds of years, I guess in like ancient Greece. And the second is from Stephen Lahar, who isn't from ancient Greece or is still alive and well. And he posits that visual experiences are literally volumetric gestalt representations of external objects implemented within a warped space resembling a bubble world. So yeah, like what am I saying with that? It sounds crazy. I'm not going to elaborate. I would recommend reading Q Clipper's post series introducing Stephen Lahar's work if you're interested in learning more on smoothbrains.net. So yeah, check that out. But Lahar is like a very fantastic researcher with regard to kind of studying not only visual perception but just like more broadly how experience kind of shapes itself in order to represent the external world. But the point I'm making in this is like more general, and I think can be applied to any given modality of experience. So in the context of talking about trip reports, if you read a trip report written by a direct realist that says something like, "I tasted the sweet golden color of laughter," you can assume they really mean it. Like laughter has a golden color, and this color has a sweet taste, and they accessed it directly. But then conversely, an indirect realist might interpret this phrase as, "The parameters of my internal world simulation were altered so that when I laughed, this triggered my visual field to erupt into a brilliant golden light. What's more, it seemed I could taste this golden light. It had a soft and sweet texture like powdered sugar, but the sensation was not local to the mouth region of my body map. Rather, it occurred everywhere within my visual field where this golden light permeated, suggesting the formation of multimodal gestalts." This isn't a real trip report. I literally just made this up to demonstrate a point, but it was kind of fun. And these kinds of experiences absolutely do exist. So yeah, in other words, it really matters how we frame our analysis of phenomenology. And yeah, by making our background assumptions explicit, we not only increase the usefulness of the report, but it becomes a lot easier in the process of writing it, because I don't have to clarify every time I want to make a statement that, this is the parameters of my world simulation have shifted or something like that. And yeah, I'll also briefly mention QRI have developed a psychophysics tool for quantifying visual psychedelic effects with various parameters such as trails, strobe, and replay, in addition to modifying effects such as persistence, intensity, and frequency. This is more psychophysics than phenomenology, but I think it's highly relevant because it allows you to analyze trends in reported subjective effects for various states of consciousness, providing some, more kind of empirical grounding for observations, if we collected enough data within phenomenology. And also this is a web app and it's free, so if you're interested in trying it out, there is psychophysics.qri.org down there. You can even access it on your phone. And if you wanted to contribute to research, this is just like very preliminary at the moment, based on what people online, they've just submitted parameters looking at the effects of a brief description. It's a web app that has just like a blue ball just bouncing around a box. And if you look at it in certain states of consciousness, you can observe, maybe this has a trail or this strobes at this particular frequency. And then you kind of go back to it when sober and you try and replicate the effects based on your memory of what the pattern looked like. And yeah, we actually do see like fairly consistent trends in the effects of some of these, these submissions. So yeah, you can check it out. You can submit your own parameters if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, finally I will get to the exciting announcement, which is, so for the last 2 years, QRI have organised 2 completely legal phenomenology research retreats. So yeah, I think it was maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, there was the Brazil retreat, and there it was studied psilocybin and ayahuasca. And then last year, this is the one that I was fortunate enough to attend, got to go to Canada, where 5-MeO-DMT research is, or taking 5-MeO-DMT is completely legal. And the aim of these retreats was basically to attract researchers with skills from various quantitative domains such as physics, maths, signal processing, visual artists, experienced meditators and psychonauts, and then me, the token philosopher, to live and work together on the shared mission of better modelling the phenomenal character of certain exotic states of consciousness. So why did we take this approach? Because obviously there are like many different ways in which you could conduct research on altered states of consciousness. To a first approximation, there are 3 modes of conducting research. There are you could do third-person studies, you could be an individual explorer and just go really deep by yourself, or you could take the think tank model. And QRI is essentially betting on the think tank model being the most likely to yield high-quality information about these states to actually solve some of the open questions or problems. And this is like broadly because, we focus on the third-person studies. The methods that they employ are typically, not always, but typically in the case of detailed phenomenology, too superficial to capture the nuances of something as complex and intrinsic to physical reality as phenomenal consciousness. So for example, if you're a researcher in the mid-19th century investigating the physical properties of magnetic fields, you wouldn't get research breakthroughs like Maxwell's equations by taking random people off the street and letting them play around with a bunch of magnets and then giving them a series of surveys. It just wouldn't happen. You need people who are very technical or technically minded and have relevant skills that are actually allow them to solve the problem. To take a real world example, actually, there was a recent study that investigated the subjective effects of combining MDMA with LSD, aka candy flipping, and it concludes, quote, MDMA co-administration with LSD did not change the quality of acute subjective effects compared with LSD alone, end quote. And they use the 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness scale, which, I'm not going to ask any of you what you think of that, but I think it's blatantly, not true, or at least it shows the limitations of the methods that are used in many of these contexts with kind of third person research. Obviously MDMA co-administration with LSD has novel effects that are kind of different than just taking them individually. But this is just a tangent. On the other hand, so just moving on, if we look at the individual explorer method of doing research, pioneered by the likes of John Lilly, Terence McKenna, and others, I think it carries serious epistemic risks, actually. And by epistemic risks, this is a twofold risk. I mean, both there is a chance that you'll go crazy in the sense of making bad inferences based on evidence and having a model of reality that is either really overfitted or really underfitted. This is something Andres has written about in some of his blog posts on Qualia computing. Or, and this is something I find more interesting, you'll probably find it difficult to meaningfully communicate your findings to others or your experiences to others, which kind of undermines the utility of such efforts for research purposes. The reasons for this are philosophically quite nuanced, and I won't go into it, although I can talk about it later if anyone's interested. But just in a single sentence, it's because your internalized reference frames for conveying semantic information have to be sufficiently synchronized to common frames of reference in order for meaning to be transmitted or for meaning to even exist in the first place. At least if you take Wittgenstein's private language argument seriously, which I do. Although this is a personal comment. I don't know about QRI as a whole, but basically, you need common frames of semantic reference in order for to be able to convey your experience with any degree of fidelity at the very least. And then the think tank model works precisely because individual researchers have the freedom to venture deep into exotic states of consciousness. They can really kind of get deep into these states and look at them closely. But they remain embedded within a linguistic community containing shared frames of semantic reference, which kind of grounds them in a sense. It's like a safety net to, even if you have an experience that seems totally out of this world, you can still kind of integrate it within a kind of shared understanding of what, the experience is and what it's doing. And that's really important. Also having everybody together in one place for an extended period We hope to create a critical mass of research activity that would lead to more substantial kind of research breakthroughs. So you could think of this as like, this is quite trendy to use as a metaphor, but like the Manhattan Project of consciousness. And yeah, while we're still processing the research outputs, the ETA I have been given is about a month from now. So if you're interested in like staying updated, because yeah, like we didn't just do these retreats and then just like talk about them and then just like make a presentation. We actually have like heaps of cool essays and like and art like representing what the 5-MeO DMT state of consciousness is actually like. Yeah, it'll be ready in a month, hopefully in early September. So you can sign up to like the QRI newsletter if you're interested. Yeah, or just like stay up to date with the social media feed. But nonetheless, I will share some general information about what we got up to. And this is, as I mentioned before, this is the third time this has been discussed, because we wanted to save it and make it like a big announcement once everything was ready. So first of all, where did we go? So we went to the Sentinel in British Columbia, Canada, which is a 5-MeO DMT kind of retreat center. But they also do other types of primarily like healing work. Like most psychedelic retreat centers are more focused on healing and yeah, kind of conventional applications of altered states of consciousness. They were kind of gracious enough to let us in as like, you know, kind of like crazy, I guess, like nerds who just want to be like really quantitative and analyze these states in a very different way. So we're like super thankful for them for that. As you can see in the photo, it's like super secluded, perfect for the type of research project that we were attempting. The retreat center itself, as I mentioned, amazing staff. They looked up after us throughout our stay, so we had like kind of shared breakfasts and shared dinners and lunches, and we were able to like actually focus not only on the research aspect but also the decompression as well. And it was situated right next to a mountain lake, so kind of great for early morning swims and the likes, and with a variety of different outdoor activities, like including like hiking available in the area, which also helps for decompression. So we booked an extended stay, approximately 2.5 weeks, to give ourselves really just like as much time as possible to study the state of consciousness, without having the time pressure to go too deep too soon. This is like especially relevant to note in the case of 5-MeO DMT. And I should also just like put a kind of verbal disclaimer here, like in talking about it, because yeah, like during the Q&A I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has them. It is, I wouldn't even consider it like a psychedelic. It's in my mind something completely different and has to be treated very seriously. So I would like really strongly encourage, if you're interested in the state of consciousness, not just kind of like experimenting by yourself or kind of treating it like something else. It's the kind of thing that like I think if we only had like 3 days, I don't think we would have made much progress, or maybe it would have actually been like bad in some respects of having to like really having that time pressure. So yeah, that was good. The days were mostly broken up into research days and working days, but we also had a lot of flexibility depending on what came up in the process. Say, if there was a research thread that I really wanted to investigate, and I was like, okay, I want a second consecutive day of like, using the 5-MeO vaporizer and just like studying this particular aspect. We had the freedom and flexibility to do that. This is the Maloka, which is a ceremonial space at the Sentinel, and that's where most of the research activities took place, in addition to morning meditations, which is really good for kind of grounding our experience, and also just creating kind of like a shared sense of like, we're in this together, trying to understand consciousness. So yeah, earlier in the retreat, we tended to host larger group sessions while we were still, I guess, familiarizing ourselves with 5-MeO state of consciousness, holding space for each other, and really just like focusing on optimizing for well-being. As I mentioned, like 5-MeO is like extremely, extremely powerful. It's not something to dive right into. And so yeah, we kind of had that focus, but then as time progressed, we started to host, I guess like smaller, more focused group sessions with specific aims, rather than having like everybody, assembled together. But it is a like beautiful space, and it really like you can have up to like 20 people in there pretty comfortably, and also just the amazing views. Yeah, so here's a photo of some of the doses we were working with. This is 5-MeO in freebase form. So we were vaporizing it using a heated loop of stainless steel mesh, kind of like roughly similar to the e-mesh method that's discussed in some online communities for NMDMT vaporization. And we had a dosing schedule that started very low at 1.5 milligrams and then gradually worked our way up in like small increments. But like actually one important finding that like I kind of stumbled across like very, very early on, because I think I'm from memory I was the first person to do it, even at the low dose, is that 5-MeO is actually, if you have an efficient vaporizer, and the vaporizer that we were using is perfectly efficient, it's active in like significantly lower doses than online online resources would otherwise recommend. So if you kind of go on like Psychonaut Wiki, and it will say, low dose is like maybe 1 to 3 milligrams, and then high dose is like, more than 6 or something like that. I honestly found that like 0.5 milligram would be like enough to really like, maybe depending on the context and depending on how fast the come up was or how the trip progressed, it could be like extremely powerful. And I would speculate that like most analog methods of vaporizing 5-MeO DMT, so like using an open flame, actually result in a lot of the material combusting. Combusted 5-MeO, to my knowledge, is not psychoactive, or at least it's like substantially less than if you get like the right vaporization setting. So yeah, like so little research has been conducted on 5-MeO, but I think this is like really relevant to note that like, if you have a good vaporizer that is actually efficient and is actually not combusting it, like online resources are actually not that useful, and you should just start really low. And then last of all, here's a photo of Andres and I after we met in the airport on the way to the retreat center. I was living in London at the time, and flew over. I didn't get much sleep on the flight, so I'm just like eating a plenty bar and somehow holding myself together. But it was exciting because it was actually the first time we met in person. But I've like kind of been following QRI stuff since maybe 2019, and so this was like an awesome meeting. So like some kind of key points, I guess like summarizing some of it. We learned just like really a lot about the state of consciousness, but I want to emphasize there's like so much that we have yet to discover. It sounds kind of cliche, but like really like there's so much here, and even though we have like a lot in the output that you'll soon see, there's just I feel like you need thousands of people working on this maybe. In order to like actually figure out what's going on. Still very excited to share what we've discovered and like the kind of the early methods that we took, sharing what worked and what didn't work for trying to kind of pioneer research of this type. As I mentioned before, we all had different skills that we brought to the table. As a philosopher, the shape of my contribution was an essay kind of analysing 5-MeO's effects on valence and also its persisting afterglow, which I found like particularly interesting. Like, my experience of 5-MeO itself was like seemingly less interesting than like almost everyone else, but I seem to have gotten like one of the biggest effects in terms of just like really just changing how I perceive the world or just my default mode of like sensory processing, which I'd be happy to talk about afterwards if anyone's interested. We'd also like to note we want to host more phenomenology retreats in the future. We think this is a neglected but like high leverage approach to modeling consciousness from the inside out. And given this specific approach that we took, focusing heavily on quantitative analysis and psychophysics, it's also exciting because these retreats are like a world first. Like this has literally never been done before. So really, really cool to try and like, build traction and try and like push this approach because I think there's a lot to it. On this note, if you or anyone has like technical skills that you think could be relevant for this kind of research, we are welcoming, I guess, applications, or you're just like welcome to send an email to maybe like Hunter on the QRI website and provide like relevant information such as your background. Because as we were saying before, like trying to get a critical mass of people with like not even just focusing on just like everybody has to be a mathematician or something like that, because I have like very few quantitative skills, but having someone else in that environment actually allowed me to like make use of their skills, and I got to like visualize a whole bunch of like crazy like vector field effects on my perception of my body map that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So that's also in my essay. So just like having people who have like technical skills, but like across a wide variety of different areas relevant to this kind of analysis. And also, yeah, just get in touch if you're interested in just helping to establish this particular approach to research and consciousness. In my mind, at least, it's not only cool and exciting to be a part of, it's also one of the few serious attempts at figuring out what consciousness and valence actually are, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, and how they relate to the rest of physical reality, which is extremely ethically important. So yeah, I think like there are actually strong ethical reasons to be like supporting this kind of research. We are also open to, if you know like somebody who has a bunch of money who wants to throw at these kinds of retreats, we're open to further funding as well. So that would allow us to increase the scope of the retreats and increase their frequency, and also maybe even just like try and like I have various other ideas for how to like encourage this kind of research approach. But as I said before, like it is really important actually that this is all done legally, and it requires like flying to countries that have like retreat centers established and that have the infrastructure set up in order to like enable us to just focus on research. Like I don't think we would have been able to go to the level of depth that we did if we just like rented an apartment in Vancouver or something like that. So yeah, definitely. I mean, you can find contact info on the QRI website, or you could even just like send me an email afterwards. I would like to finish with what I think is, for me at least, one of the most inspiring kind of passages that makes me want to kind of work on this and like dedicate more resources toward it and more effort. It's this is David Pearce. He is a good friend of mine, and he is also one of the founding reasons for QRI's existence, and also a lot of suffering reduction work, both within effective altruism, but also just more broadly within like animal advocacy, which is, yeah, as I mentioned, something that I have a background in. So he has this like 2009 interview, and I'll just read a passage from the interview. So he says, "I think it's hard to overstate the cognitive significance of major psychedelics for the future of sentience. But it's also hard to convey why these agents can be valuable tools for investigation for academics who have never tried them. I know distinguished drug-naive philosophers of mind and transhumanists who are certain that psychedelia can't be significant and it would be irresponsible to urge them to put their assumptions to the test. Perhaps the best I can do is to offer an analogy. Imagine an ultra-intelligent tribe of congenitally blind extraterrestrials. Their ignorance of vision and visual concepts is not explicitly represented in their conceptual scheme. To members of this hypothetical species, visual experiences wouldn't be information-bearing any more than a chaotic, drug-induced eruption of bat-like echolocatory experiences would be information-bearing to us. Such modes of experience have never been recruited by evolution to play a sensory or signaling function. At any rate, sometime during the history of this imaginary species, one member of the tribe discovers a drug that alters his neurochemistry. The drug doesn't just distort his normal senses and sense of self, it triggers what we would call visual experiences, vivid, chaotic in texture, and weirder than anything the drug taker had ever imagined. What can this drug-intoxicated subject do to communicate his disturbing new categories of experience to his tribe's scientific elite? If he simply says his experiences are ineffable, then the skeptics will scorn such mysticism and obscurantism. If he speaks metaphorically and expresses himself using words from the conceptual scheme grounded in the dominant sensory modality of his species, then he'll probably babble delirious nonsense. Maybe he'll start talking about messages from the gods or whatever. Critically, this drug user lacks the necessary primitive terms to communicate his experiences, let alone a theoretical understanding of what's happening. Understandably, the knowledge elite are unimpressed by the drug-disturbed user's claims of making a profound discovery. They can exhaustively model the behavior of the stuff of the physical world with the equations of their scientific theories, and their formal models of mind are computationally adequate. The drug taker sounds psychotic. Yet from our perspective, we can see that the alien psychonaut has indeed stumbled upon a profound discovery, even though he has scarcely glimpsed its implications, the raw materials of what we would call the visual world in all its glory. And I will end with that. So thank you all for coming. These are two of my websites and the QRI URL. But does anyone have any questions after all of that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just very nice talk, thank you. I just had a question about what kinds of methods you're using to bring together all these different reports of the psychedelic experiences.
Like what methods we're using in our own analysis of conducting the retreat. So yeah, initially it was a bit more structured. As I mentioned, we kind of had like a larger group, kind of holding space for everyone, and kind of like just getting familiar with like very low doses of it. And it was kind of just like dipping your toes in the water, testing the water type stuff. But it really actually, like, there's no unifying method. There is like a unifying kind of like agreement that like, we should be studying or modeling these states with a lot more detail than has previously been done. But the exact method will probably depend a lot on the relevant skills of the researcher. So Andres, for example, he's really big into psychophysics. He's got some like really cool stuff to show from the Brazil retreat and also the Canada retreat of like patterns and gestalts that you can see within patterns that you can only see in certain states of consciousness. And you can actually just look at it sober, and then you can look at it in that state, and you have a different visual experience. So there's that kind of thing. But this is also like outside of like my scope. Like I'm probably a bit more interested in the kind of philosophical, how do I kind of use like semantic concepts to latch on to the phenomenal character, and how can I model valence in a way that's productive in order to solve various ethical problems that I'm concerned with. And so for me it was like much more just like dive headfirst, have as many possible different experiences of different varieties, and then the interesting ones, like maybe like less than 10% of my experience. I had actually like over 100 experiences with 5-MeO at the retreat, based on a Fermi estimate that I did afterwards. So like, it might have been more or less. Like most of my experiences were actually just kind of like, okay, like I just need to know how to be in the state. Like what kind of mental moves do I do? In certain states you kind of want to like focus on maybe certain aspects to investigate the quality of certain sensory modalities or sensations through those modalities. With 5-MeO, I found that like I was unable to contract my awareness to like attend to any part of my experience at higher doses without it being very painful. So I actually had to learn to not pay attention to anything in the state, which is just like totally counterintuitive. But yeah, my hypothesis is basically 5-MeO kind of wants to be like as unified, or like it wants complete symmetry, and what attention does within the field of experience is it kind of breaks those symmetries. So yeah, that was my method. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yeah, lots of different types. Any other questions? Yeah. Cool.
So I really like your slide about the different philosophical approaches and how that might impact your reports of your experience. I think that's true, and I think it's been a long-standing problem in the phenomenological approaches to consciousness. People just sort of report things that seem to embed their own theoretical assumptions, and then that leads, it seems to be not objective. And you can kind of take that worry further in the direction of eliminative materialism, where you think actually just whatever our best scientific theory is eventually going to tell us, that's what consciousness is like. But I wonder whether actually the QRI approach that you've been talking about, does that partly address that response, but with the idea of focusing on these structural features. Are those structural features actually, you could argue, invariant under those changes of the background theory? So, the descriptions of these symmetrical patterns, geometrical descriptions, seems like that's how you would describe them, even if you came up with a completely different theory of consciousness, and that might be an advantage of this QRI approach.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, maybe as I said, I'm kind of biased in making or emphasizing that point about philosophical background assumptions because I am a philosopher, and that's just what I'm interested in. In my case, because my output was almost entirely kind of word based, and I was writing essays. I think that's a lot more relevant in the context of kind of writing an essay or writing like a theoretical analysis of a state of consciousness. But say if you're a mathematician and you're analyzing like the symmetry groups that appear within like tessellations within your experience on a certain maybe not 5-MeO but maybe like NN or LSD or something like that, then you're right, that's kind of like invariant, regardless of if you're a direct realist or an indirect realist, if you have the right conceptual tools in order to do this kind of like phenomenological analysis, then it doesn't actually matter, what your background assumptions are. And so, this is certainly a strong argument in favor of actually trying to, to the best of our, to the best of our capacity, try and provide descriptions that are somewhat ontologically agnostic. So you don't have to assume I am a limitivist materialist. You don't have to assume I'm, a non-materialist physicalist. Or I'm an idealist or whatever in order to actually do a lot of meaningful research. Although depending on the shape of your essay, that could help. Yeah.
You talked about the distinction between structure and content, right? Or I think you said structure and representation.
Yeah.
It's something I think a lot about, and I wonder whether the two are entirely distinct or whether there's a gray area in between. And I wonder if you thought about this yourself.
Yes. Yeah. So the question was regarding kind of structure and content, or the phenomenal content or the representational content in the slide that I had earlier. And if it's as clear cut of a distinction, right? Is there a space in between? I definitely think so. I think this is it's a useful framing of a problem in a lot of trip reports that I see, where it's just standing here right now, I have to actually assume a bunch of axioms that allow me to assume that I'm conveying meaning to all of you, and I'm speaking at the semantic level just because I'm using words, right? So it's definitely it's not a matter of just entirely doing one or the other. I did have there is a part of my essay where I am kind of probing at this kind of the space in between, where I'm talking about the afterglow of my experience, and something I personally had as a result of doing all the 5-MeO was my instinct up until I guess the retreat was I would have an experience and there'd be a sort of implicit kind of labeling or categorizing or kind of creating dualities within different percepts or the phenomena, like chair, person, room, space, non-space, that's filled up with something. And then maybe with sounds, sometimes you kind of associate certain emotions or certain concepts with certain vocalizations or patterns in sound. That kind of implicit labeling or conceptualization really significantly reduced. So I found that rather than not even in the conscious sense of thinking abstractly and thinking there is the chair there is this and that, in my experience it was almost like I could kind of lock onto that way of looking, but that wasn't the default state anymore. And I think there's actually something to this in maybe a pre-theoretical sense of just really sensing differences between different phenomena or different kind of qualia values within our experience. Anyway, that's addressed in my essay, but certainly worth considering.
Let's take one more question, and unless you took that.
Sorry if this is a little incoherent. I guess kind of related to the last question, I just wonder if you think there are any limits to this kind of data-driven structural analysis kind of approach, because when you were talking, I was kind of drawing an analogy in my mind with art and making art, which also deals with qualia, with phenomenon, with subjective experience. And it's so for example, the scene before all of our eyes at the moment, it's so infinitely complex that kind of approach, structural kind of approach, trying to describe everything that we're seeing, even though it's not particularly remarkable, or even a representational approach. where again you try and sum this up in a very literal way. It seems like literary history to tell you that neither of those approaches are actually effective. Instead, it's a metaphorical use of language that would allow you, maybe like a skilled writer could, in a few phrases, a few brushstrokes, like give you something that actually evokes what we're all seeing now much more effectively than either a structural or a representational approach. So I guess, yeah, for me there seems to be like a really strong relation between creation of art and the kind of work you're trying to do. And I just wonder, like with this approach of collecting masses of data, it would kind of be contrary to what you see in art, where it is like, you're able to sum these things up, where a metaphorical use of language can actually capture something that maybe like a large data set isn't.
Yeah. This is actually something that I was recently in Tucson, Arizona, for the Science of Consciousness conference, and I got to meet one of my intellectual heroes, Shamil Chandaria, and have a conversation with him. And I was kind of like actually addressing this kind of thing. Like I have, even though like I'm consider myself a pioneer of this particular approach to doing research, I still hold that like it's impossible to perfectly capture the what it is likeness or the kind of texture or the quality of the experience. I think there are like more or less skillful ways at pointing toward the thing that we're trying to capture, or trying to express it, using like frames that are kind of like publicly accessible. But yeah, I see this as like maybe like a problem at the level of like phenomenology is itself, it's not individually sufficient to solve the problem. I think it's like maybe jointly sufficient with like more kind of third person research and maybe like, I think you need a collection of different approaches. But Shamil's kind of comment to me was basically what you just said. He was like, all you can do is really just use poetry to express. And I think there's actually like, there is something to that. Like when I in my essay, hopefully this comes across, but like I am like very analytical, but I am also trying to use language beautifully, because this is like, I think there's really something to this point. And QRI also more broadly, I should note, has like emphasized actually involving like artists and making like the project of phenomenology also a project in art, both like visual and also like through different sensory modalities. Like music is an example of art that is non-visual, but I think can clearly like capture certain emotions or textures of experience. So cool. And I will also there'll be a extended Q&A maybe as a part of the Young conference, and so just like if you have any more specific questions, come up and talk to me there. But thank you all for coming.